Just as an experiment, I thought I would read something because I thought maybe I'm going to read some of these books that I mentioned to you little by little. They can just go into a playlist. Because I thought maybe I'd read the Herman Hesse book to you. And I just wanted to do this as a trial run. So it's Loren E Pedersen and it's subtitled The Unconscious Forces That Shape Men's Lives. And I'm going to read from chapter 6, Man the Slayer, the Dark Side of Masculinity. So there's a quote, Nico Tinbergen, "Man is the only species that is a mass murderer, the only misfit in his own society. Why should this be so?" Awareness of evil. The ancient concept of the dark side of human nature is recorded in mythology, folk legend, and fairy tales, as well as in the religion and philosophy of both primitive peoples and classical civilizations. That which is dark and sinister within was probably initially projected outward as a force in nature, as a dark god or goddess, or later in Christianity as the devil. This projection or externalization of iniquity has been one of humanity's greatest problems. The projection process creates a polarization of nature, turning its original cycle of life and death into a moral problem of good and evil. On a collective level, there has always been a remarkable intolerance in human beings to recognize that adversity may reside within. When people inevitably begin to recognize that this dark side existed in individuals, possession by evil spirits was blamed. This aspect of human experience was originally conceived within religions as the problem of evil. In the history of psychiatry and psychology, evil began to be viewed as disease, neurosis, or psychosis. We have now come to recognize the internal nature of psychological conflict, which expresses itself in a myriad of symptomatic forms such as delusions, persecutions, psychosomatic diseases, and so forth. Freud and his followers had established the place of psychoanalysis by the beginning of the 20th century. But the prevailing influence of Freud's early training in neurology and medicine left its mark on the foundation of psychoanalysis as a strongly biological rationale for the basic dynamics of mental functioning. In the last 100 years, this biological focus of human behavior has been often overused as a rationalization to explain the problem of evil as well as aggression. Although Freud saw evil as residing within the person, he formulated this idea as part of the duality within the psyche that came to be known as the death instinct. His later theory of drives, formulated in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, posited that this duality consisted of a sexual drive and an aggression drive. A polarity of masculine and feminine was inherent in Freud's theory of the instincts of sex and aggression. That the death instinct was part of his theory followed naturally from which Erich Fromm and others referred to as the patriarchal tradition, which perpetuated the view that women were inferior and crippled version of men. That is, that women were castrated. This central point seems to have sprung from an unconscious splitting of masculine from feminine, as well as good from evil. As a result of this split, a man is over-identified with the masculine pole of his psyche and disassociated from his own endogenous power. Rather than being able to rest with a conscious sense of superiority, he is saddled with an unconscious sense of inferiority, a sense of inadequacy vis-a-vis the creative maternal and feminine. In this way, he becomes impaired in his ability to promote life, to nurture, and to relate effectively and empathetically with either men or women. The anima, then, even though it is projected, is best understood in this context as an incomplete, damaged sense of self. How is this related to aggression? Freud's death instinct became a rationalization for the evil that men do, as if aggression and the drive for power and control were simply attributes of their sex. Another way of viewing the death instinct is to see it as a result of men's need for power, which is in turn a function of their exaggerated exogenic means of coping with the world, women, and themselves. Or stated another way, a result of their failure to incorporate the feminine in themselves. We can surmise that men then need women as a group to carry this deprecated image of femininity. In this way, women may be said to be carriers of an anima image that is contaminated by the masculine shadow. Understood in this way, much of what is known as aggression in men can be accounted for. A historical instance of this collective projection can be seen in the persecution of witches in the Middle Ages, when millions of women were murdered for imagined or symbolic activities they were performing, especially in the making of pacts with the devil. My guess is that Freud never fully succeeded in justifying his dualistic instinct theory, because he could never also fully resolve his own inner masculine-feminine split. His unconscious attempt at resolution, if one can call it that, was to project this incomplete sense of masculinity onto women, seeing them as inferior men. Aspects of his personal life seem to betray this split. His rigid need to maintain authority in the face of challenges from those around him, his incessant preoccupation with death, the way he related to his daughter Anna, and his projection of inferiority onto women. As a society, we seem to have lost the understanding that many of our psychic struggles are manifestations of inner splitting and a refusal to acknowledge that there are undesirable elements within us all. The Jungian, the shadow. I think I'm more with Jung anyway than Freud. The Jungian concept of the shadow offers a fertile starting point for examining the psychological origins of men's violence towards each other and toward those they love. As Jung states, unfortunately, there is no doubt about the fact that man is, as a whole, less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The shadow aspect of our personality consists of those parts of ourselves that we have learned through experience are not tolerable to others, especially to our parents. When those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors become acceptable to us, we split from them. To fully understand the concept of the shadow, we need to understand what splitting is and how it both helps and hinders us in our efforts to achieve the greatest level of self-reflective consciousness. Splitting is a universal psychological phenomenon that takes place in the earliest stages of childhood, as the ego is being formed. It continues through life, functioning both as a defense mechanism and as a means of differentiating ourselves from part of the mother. Its own ego only emerges as a separate sense of self around the age of 3 or so. Splitting from the mother at this point is entirely normal and assists in the development of a stable ego, or the sense of I-ness. Another form of splitting occurs as we attempt to discriminate between different parts of ourselves so that the sense of what I and what is not I is further clarified. While the splitting process helps establish boundaries of the ego, it can also function defensively to split off the undesirable parts of the ego and relegate them to the unconscious as shadow. In general, these are qualities that are not congruent with the more socialized or persona aspects of our personality. However, since no part of the personality is ever completely lost, split-off parts become relegated to a less apparent, more unconscious level of the psyche. In other words, the more difficult it is for us to accept certain disturbing qualities in ourselves, the more unlikely they will be relegated to the shadow aspect of our personalities. The more likely they will be relegated to the shadow aspect of our personalities. The splitting process becomes complicated by the fact that negative feelings that we repress or disown gain a particularly strong, though unconscious, emotional charge. The nature of the psyche is such that nothing of any emotional consequence remains truly unexpressed, even though we may be unaware of the forms in which we are expressing it. So, even though these disassociated qualities are unconscious, their peculiar emotional charge causes them to push for expression. The expressed form of the unconscious emotional contact may then arise as projection. What we have disowned is projected onto others, who consequentially we will reject as being somehow less than or inferior to ourselves. And I think we all sometimes should realize that when we dislike things in others or we dislike others, we're often just recognizing things in them that we dislike in ourselves. These projections are always accompanied by strong, often negative feelings, such as revulsion, disgust, anger, or fear, our previously repressed emotional reactions to our own unacceptable qualities. Our projections, then, are the ostracized elements of our own personalities. That is why when we encounter a carrier of some of split-off shadow quality, we have such a strong and often irrational emotional reaction. The reaction itself often indicates that a shadow has been activated. The collective shadow. The shadow becomes collective when it manifests in the attitudes and behavior of large groups, or when one individual comes to personify it, embodying the collective evil. Personifications of the collective shadow include Napoleon, Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, Stalin, and Jim Jones of the People's Temple. What seems remarkable is that all of these men were initially motivated, at least superficially, by political, religious, or psychological, philosophical images of achieving an utopian ideal. They all viewed themselves as being facilitators of much-needed reforms that ultimately would benefit their group, if not humankind. But in each case, there also was an equally powerful obsession to exclude, by whatever means, from this ideal state those elements that were considered to be incompatible, inconsistent, or anti-ethical to their point of view. Sorry, my reading's getting a bit more difficult because I think I'm starting to get my mouth to bleed, so sorry. That sounds gross. Apologies. Anywho, on with the reading. War is perhaps one of the best examples of a shadow problem carried out in a collective arena of mutual projection. Little individual consciousness is expressed in the preparation for and engagement in war. It is in war that men are again thoroughly split from the feminine and nature, both in the ways they act and in the ways they view their opponents. I don't think the dynamic is essentially much different from the antics and passions aroused by a football game, in which allegiance is based more on the city one lives in than by the virtues of one's team. The issue is often one of a wounded narcissism trying to heal itself through forms of justified vengeance. The history of civilization abounds with examples of the deplorable consequences of scapegoating, such as the persecution of witches, the Nazis' murder of the Jews, and the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. As well as the other atrocities against minorities and women. The splitting process often occupies a central and critical role in mass movements and belief systems, serving to maintain the group's identity, beliefs, and convictions. In this way, the group's point of view becomes compulsively dogmatic, arrogant, dictatorial, and increasingly intolerant of anything that departs from it. Whether this point of view is political, religious, or scientific, it begins narcissistically to exert a claim on what is right, whether also establishing a definition of reality that claims to know what is wrong, incorrect, immortal, and evil. So where, then, does evil really lie? Perhaps, like beauty, evil is also in the eye of the beholder. There is no universal consensus of what is evil. Can I just repeat that? So where then does evil really lie? Perhaps, like beauty, evil is also in the eye of the beholder. There is no universal consensus of what is evil. The personal shadow. On a personal level, the shadow can often be found in dreams, fantasies, and of course as projections onto others. When the shadow is projected, it may be carried by an individual or by a whole group of like individuals. The shadow is often experienced in terms of negative value judgments, accompanied by strong negative emotions. The shadow is almost always identified from the perspective of how one would not like to be seen either by oneself or others, that is, not I. A man's shadow character is most commonly represented as a male figure, but there are many instances in which the shadow may also be represented as a woman with particularly negative qualities. In these cases, the shadow may be contaminated by some aspect of the man's anima or his mother. This may also be seen in a dream where a woman the man knows personally and admires is in the company of undesirables. In this case, the man often can't figure out why this woman would be in such a bad company, because his conscious associations to her are so positive. The answer may reside in a number of possibilities. One is that the dreamer may be unconscious of some negative associations or feelings he has to the person and needs to block his image of her. A second possibility is that the dreamer may have some unacceptable wishes or impulses towards this woman that he cannot allow himself to acknowledge in his conscious state, so he compromises by having the admired person be in the company of these others, who carry some aspect of his shadow. In this second case, the dream allows him to begin to become aware of the suppressed wishes or impulses in a form that at least initially keeps them at a distance. A third instance in which this dream situation may occur is if the dreamer has been regarding this woman in an unrealistically positive way. The dream may be performing a compensatory function to modify the dreamer's exaggerated perception. This dream situation is just as likely to be represented in this way if it is another man with whom the dreamer is concerned. The shadow may also appear in a number of different guises, human or less than human. A man's shadow may manifest as a child, an adult male, an old man, with each representing a different developmental level. In general, the more disassociated the shadow qualities are, the more primitive the representation is going to be. The shadow may have features that are primitive, animalistic, crippled, deformed, or even mutilated. Because the appearance of the shadow character in a dream varies, it is seldom recognized as a part of oneself and is more likely to be experienced as alien to one's conscious identity. From the conscious standpoint, the dreamer will often be judgmental about the shadow character and will wish to disassociate from him. Frequently, this character will cause some trouble within the dream and will evoke strong negative feelings in the dreamer. For example, when one of the men in my men's group had the following dream, and when the author, that's the author talking in the men's group of Loren E Pedersen. For example, one of the men in my men's group had the following dream. An armoured truck raises its guns and fires into the night sky. Half a dozen men flanking the truck do likewise. A glow in the air illuminates the truck and 2 soldiers are felled by machine gun fire. All those in the truck scramble out and clumsily crawl through a nearby barbed wire fence. Just then, a group of soldiers on horseback riding through the hillock arrives, surrounding their prey, Adolf Hitler and his escape party. Everyone who fled from the truck is shot several times, including 2 women. The soldiers then take a handheld electrical probe and place it on the temples of the dead group, searing their brains. Then a knife is thrust into the temples of Hitler and another man, and a portion of their cranial matter is dug out. As this occurs, the dead Hitler's eyes look up peacefully and pleadingly. This man's dream portrays the shadow in a quite primitive form. The dream was particularly upsetting for him because his strong persona and ego allowed little conscious violence or rage. His parents, both alcoholics, had forbidden the expression of anger in any form by any member of the family. As a result, his perception of anger was that it was particularly malevolent and a dangerous emotion. His dream represents the shadow in archetypal proportions as Hitler. The shadow needs to be completely killed off. So Hitler, as the dreamer's latent rage, is killed, and he becomes both peaceful and pleading. The peacefulness represents the persona's success in quieting the shadow, but the pleading quality may refer to the shadow's need for acknowledgement. The dreamer really needs to be more conscious of this rage and accepting of it. This will allow him to broaden his perception of himself and the depth of his feelings. It will also prevent the rage from being acted out in some unconscious form. Recognition of the powerful feelings connected with the shadow does not mean that a man will need to or even want to act on them. Rather, it represents an opportunity to accept them as part of the complex emotional repertoire that makes up his psychological life. With increased awareness and ownership of these feelings, he is able to recognize key emotional conflicts, often for the first time. On the other hand, repressing feelings that are unacceptable to the ego or persona creates psychological and sometimes physical symptoms, which the ego experiences instead of the repressed feelings. Continued suppression can affect a man's general energy level, often resulting in moodiness, irritability, depression, irrational fears, phobias, and preoccupations with death. It also takes a lot of psychic energy in the form of defensiveness, hypervigilance, and suspicion to project one's shadow onto others and then to maintain a disassociated state of non-reflective consciousness. In such states, there is often a rigid self-righteousness. True believers and those who are certain that they know the truth beyond doubt are upset by any departures from their perceptions, primarily because another point of view threatens their image, their feelings of self-worth, and their basic beliefs. If a man's ego is not strong enough to contain his split-off feelings, his basic defenses will not be adequate to maintain the dissociated state. And sorry, it's dissociated state. I'm not talking about dissociation. In this case, there's a greater likelihood that he will attack the carrier or carriers of his shadow based on his perception that the other is as he is perceived to be, no matter how irrational or idiosyncratic this perception may be. It's 25 minutes. I am halfway through. Well, I'm nearly finished Man the Slayer. Heck, let's just go for it. Cultural contributions to the shadow in men. Excuse me. The shadow qualities of men are shaped both by behavior that is discouraged and by behavior that is rewarded or reinforced by parents and the culture at large. In this way, boys in Western culture learn to conform to behavioral patterns that are defined as manly. For example, young boys are often rewarded for being aggressive with other boys. They are expected to be able to defend themselves and to not come home crying. A boy who does not defend himself, whether that is something he wishes to do or not, is considered a sissy and is often humiliated by parents, particularly his father, and by his peers. In the inner city of Chicago, where I grew up, the author, a boy's competence was not based on how well he did in school, but on how well he defended himself. To be tough was a virtue that was admired by one's peers. It conferred a degree of security and self-confidence, a much sought-after haven when one is exposed to violence on a virtual daily basis. In my childhood, I witnessed a man shooting his wife and then dragging her body down the street, says the author. The first time I ever came home after a fight I had lost, when I was 10, my stepfather told me in no uncertain terms that I was to go back out and beat up the other boy, and if I didn't, he would beat me up. As it turned out, I did go back and beat up the other boy, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to avoid being beat up by my own stepfather, who had already humiliated me for not winning in the first place. My stepfather had received a Purple Heart in World War II, as well as a case of shell shock that lasted many years of his life, and he told me that my time for war would also come. But even though he obviously had been traumatized by his experience, he refused to discuss it, simply maintaining that when my time came, I would serve and do my duty. Killing people in defense of my country seemed to be part of what it meant to be a man. But it was a part that I secretly feared and abhorred, although I felt too ashamed to say so. In spite of those fears, as a teenager I became the leader of a gang in which every member except me was on probation. I was not until I was almost killed in a fight that I saw how unconscious my attempt was to have status in my family and my peer group. When my time came for war, Vietnam, I couldn't go because of severe hearing impairment. Even though I became involved in the anti-war movement, I initially felt guilty for not having gone. After I finally admitted this to my anti-war friends, I learned that they felt the same way. We all felt guilty, even though we disagreed with the war on moral grounds. We also felt tremendous compassion for our brothers who, for whatever reason, had to go. In American culture, boys are often given more positive reinforcement and less punishment for aggressive behavior than are girls. In fact, at 2 years of age, both boys and girls hit, scream, and cry with nearly equal frequency. But by the age of 4, boys do more hitting and less screaming than girls. Girls generally become more verbally aggressive than boys, especially as they grow older, while boys become more physically aggressive. Other research indicates that preschool rage and tantrum behaviors are predictive of adolescent and adult aggression for males, but not for females. Other studies in child development show that aggressiveness is reinforced through imitation. That is, Children who early on witness parents and adults behaving aggressively increase their own aggressive behavior even without rewards for doing so. These studies show that men who witnessed violence between their parents were almost 3 times as likely to hit their wives as were those whose parents had not been violent. The sons of those most violent parents had a rate of wife abuse 1,000 times greater than sons of non-violent parents. Several other studies have also found that witnessing abuse between parents is the most powerful determinant of becoming an abuser, even more so than if the man was a victim of child abuse. Also, interestingly, the most consistent characteristic observed among victims of wife abuse is that women who witnessed violence between their parents while growing up. So we see that cultural and familial influence pattern individual male behavior in a fashion that men might not freely choose had they the choice. For example, what is often collectively considered to be manly behavior prescribes an unreflective way of being in the world. The following vignette appears in the psychological literature as an attempt to describe a young boy's problem. However, it fails to explain his relationship to the feminine, or rather what the feminine is missing for him. BJ, age 5 years, referred to his combined sexual and aggressive impulses as his robber feelings. He described how he, as policeman, seemed to be in constant battle to keep the robbers in jail. As his immature superego seemed to function more to punish than to help him to be in control of his impulses, he usually felt that the policeman was out having coffee when most needed, but was sure to punish when the robbers took over. Failure to integrate sexual and aggressive impulses into a valued view of the self as in charge undermines self-confidence, heightens fears of punishment, and the projected aggression heightens castration anxiety. A defensive facade of masculinity characterized by aggressive sexuality and demeaning or chauvinistic attitudes toward women may emerge, an obvious element in the exaggerated macho character. Social and cultural stereotypes, as well as psychological stereotypes of men, often exert a collective effort on men's shadow problems. Many shadows of this can be seen in psychological work with adolescent boys who have not yet achieved a stable sense of identity and who are struggling to define themselves in terms of the prevailing cultural stereotypes. These societal values powerfully influence a boy's sense of identity and reinforce gender-specific attitudes and behavior. The role-playing that men do at work